Hi, welcome back to day one, the Science and Wisdom of Emotion Summit. I'm Dr. Eve Ekman, and I'm delighted to be your host today. In this session, I'm introducing you to Christian Howard, and he'll really bring us through a practice that's unique to our embodied and contemplative approach for getting some freedom from our destructive emotions. We can think of this in some ways as an antidote. Christian Howard is a socially engaged Buddhist teacher. He integrates his study and practice of Tibetan Buddhist traditions, including Gelug and Nyingma lineages, into his practice and his work. He is a narrative designer and a cultural strategist, building equitable features for individuals, communities, and organizations. Welcome, Christian. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Eve. I'm very, very delighted to be here.
So we're going to go ahead and get started with a simple question, and yet a very deep question, which ties into, of course, the whole theme of this conference. How does working with destructive emotions and cultivating constructive emotions show up in what you bring to community and with your own experience as a practitioner?
It's a really great question, and you've outlined a couple of the different ways that I show up in the world, both as a storyteller and as a writer, and as someone who holds space for the more strategic ways that people need to move through problems. So often when people reach out to me, it's in a support capacity, and they're usually in moments of really great transition. There's a very real, very large expression of the gap between where they are currently and where they would like to go. So for me as a practitioner, in showing up, especially in support capacities, it helps to keep things really simple and to know what resources we have available to us. So asking things like, what are the things that we already know? Right? Or what can I turn to in a moment where I feel mired in delusion and confusion and disruption? And so I know for myself, just a few days ago, I had a really, really strong wave of anxiety, just a lot of things going on, a lot of deadlines happening. And so I turned to practices that were necessary for me, that really feel like my refuge. They feel like my home. And a lot of those tend to be conative practices. They tend to be compassion practices. They tend to be foundational insight practices. So weaving things that are already known or a bit familiar into a structure that can kind of support all of these different needs really feels like the best way through for me. And sometimes that formal space of practice just isn't available, right? For example, so many of us now are tossed between work meetings on Zoom or online and managing household duties and all of the expectations of just life. So really finding those turn-to practices, the things that allow us to cultivate a really rich sense of safety and connection, those are the things that I oftentimes go to first.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's really meaningful to highlight this idea of almost having an apothecary for our meditation practices. I'd like to hear a little bit more about why focusing maybe on emotion makes sense with meditation. Many people assume I'm going to meditate so I can get away from emotions, not so that I will maybe face or go towards them. Can you help us understand this idea of actually using our meditation as a way to address some of our difficult or disturbing emotions?
Sure. I mean, I think the simplest way that I think about it is really looking at the Buddhist tradition and all of the sort of rich opportunities that it has to explore the ways in which the perspective of emotion itself is really the conditioning through which we see and perceive reality around us. And noting that it is this lens through which we actually get to experience. And if that experience is altered through that lens, then focusing on that lens really makes sense, right? As a storyteller, noting that if I am in a position where I cannot access the deeper parts of who I am and what I want to see reflected into the world, if that is disturbed or disrupted or in some ways obscured from me, that I can't actually show up and do the work that I would like to do.
Hmm.
And I can't actually walk other people through that work as well, because my disturbances are going to create more disturbances for others. So there's a very real personal responsibility and levels of accountability for myself, but also levels of accountability that translate into the kind of community-based practices, the sort of human-centered design, the community-centered design that I really, really hold true. And then rooted more deeply into that, the ethics that I try and carry forth, the ethics and the values that I try to embody and imbue in everything that I'm doing, they're so deeply rooted in self-knowledge and self-understanding. So it is a constant practice of self-inquiry to make sure that at any given time I am showing up with the best possible intentions, with the understanding of potential impact. And then I'm kind of carrying that through with this exploration, this openness, and this kindness for myself of really being okay with what I find when I look deeply into it.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love how you highlighted this. What a teacher who we have both learned a lot from, Alan Wallace, says, this idea of polishing our inner lens, right? So that we can see clearly inward. And then you also mention that this has to be alongside clear ethics. What is our goal and motivation? How are we moving toward the support of the communities that we want to be engaging with? We can't simply expect that we show up every day fully kind, open, and compassionate without doing a lot of work to get there. I think, the practice that we're going to have you lead us through, it's a really beautiful example of how we can train the mind and heart right here in our little laboratory of a meditation experience that really helps us every day in the world. And, I think what's interesting is when we talk about a freedom from our difficult or disturbing emotions, as Matthieu Ricard has beautifully said, the point is not to get rid of something, but to dispel a mistake, getting rid of our unknowing, our wrong perception. So in Matthieu's framing, our destructive emotions are anything that disturbs the mind, not just when we act out and we are super inappropriately angry at someone, or when we withdraw and isolate. Those are the behaviors of our destructive emotions. Matthieu is suggesting that when we really want to understand and get to the very roots of the destructive emotions, we do so by having this bigger frame or lens that we really can see clearly where our perception gets a bit diluted or distracted or disturbed. So there is a reality we want to be able to see. We want to have clarity when we receive a text or message from someone. How do we not project onto it our own insecurities, our own stress? And one of the antidotes, or one of the ways we can see clearly, is this practice that you're going to be leading us through. And I'm curious to hear from you this incredibly challenging and wonderful question. What does it mean to see reality as it is? What is that?
So Eve, I love this question, and it is a bit daunting to have to answer, the nature of reality, of conditioned reality in the middle of a work week. But what I love about it is, right, and you're bringing the very real, palpable realities of what do you do when you get a text message and you need to respond to it, but you also have so many other things going on. And what I turn to is a framework that you and I are both familiar with. It's really thinking of cognitive balance. And in the framework of cultivating emotional balance, there is such a strong attention toward recognizing the ways of just superimposing, right, these stories onto moments of feeling, and really trying to notice how we can learn to be with the sensations, learn to be with the feelings that are arising, without missing what's really there in terms of conventional reality. And so for me, I oftentimes reflect on this because I understand, as so many of us do, how much intricate work goes into actually realizing cognitive balance. It's not an easy thing. It's not something that comes just by observing the sensations that we're having. It's not, noticing the subtlety of a sense or a feeling and then everything's fine. But it's a lot of undoing the ways that we've been conditioned to show up, to see things, to believe. And the hard work, the dedication, the compassion, the empathy it takes to actually commit yourself to that as a practice. What I love is that it is in service of eventually being able to learn how to use both this logical thinking and this intuition, and kind of bridging them together, bringing them into a space where they are pointing towards the different kinds of knowing available to us. And also recognizing and building that wisdom and that insight to really, really know that these are all working towards the same goal of cultivating emotional balance, that you can have your intuition, you can have that logical part, you can have the sort of sensory-based experiences, that they're all leading us somewhere. And if we follow them, they're leading us somewhere together. So for me, it's the focusing on sensations without superimposing these stories. And I say this as a very sensitive writer, that I understand the stories are there and I want the stories to be there, but recognizing that I can focus on these sensations. And just like having and being able to see, the beauty of that story that is guiding me to a different understanding of the world, that I can see these sensations from a beginning all the way through the logical end that they have in the manifestation of something larger than the sensation itself. It's this understanding of my own emotional reactivity that really allows me to say, I know that at its core, understanding reality means I have to suspend that reactivity for a while. I have to be able to find and cultivate practices that allow me to put more space between feeling something and immediately reacting to it. And also recognizing the sort of overabundance of ways in which I have been conditioned to build story for everything. And how sometimes that story is great. It really proves that, that my intuition is in alignment with what I want to do. Other times it's just a story. And being able to recognize the difference between those is a big, big, big benefit. I think in that, if going deeper for myself and really thinking about the CEB framework, I think about the relationship between starting with these, with emotions as, precognizant, and really thinking about the ways in which emotions then lead to, sensations really lead to feelings, and being able to recognize these feelings as pleasant or unpleasant or neutral, being able to track how those feelings sort of manifest into thinking, patterns of thinking, outdated patterns of thinking for me especially, and then how that thinking sort of evolves into these more robust stories, and those stories too have patterns and shapes and flavors all their own, and recognizing that as a process. And this is, I think, where my work as a sort of designer and a strategist comes in, recognizing that if there is a process, if there is a story, that there are moments in that process where I can interrupt and I can make different decisions. And that can change the outcome, which before seemed inevitable. And once paying a little bit more attention to it, once really thinking about how it shows up for me, I can start to put more space there. I can start to breathe more life into it. And I can find ways of forgiveness of patterns that no longer serve me, things that do not live up to those ethics and those intentions that I was speaking about earlier. I think if I'm really trying to dig deeply into why these practices are important, so much of it is really to cultivate a better relationship with myself, to really become a better friend to myself in any moment and at any stage, knowing that I'm constantly transforming.
Beautiful. All right. Shall we give our wonderful audience an opportunity to become a better friend to themselves?
Sure. Friendliness coach. That's what we're doing. So I will lead us in a mindfulness meditation, exploring phenomena for about 20 minutes or so. And this can be practiced in a stationary posture. either seated in a chair or maybe being supported by cushions. And you might also find it useful to try this practice lying down, if that position is comfortable and accessible for you. And so the main considerations here are to notice and observe with kindness any physical sensations and emotions as they're arising in your own unique perspective. So as we begin, I invite you to find a stationary posture that's comfortable for you. Something where your spine can be straight and allows your body to assume a position that invites both deep relaxation and alertness. Being relaxed and alert sometimes sound or feel at odds with one another. But together, they really offer us the opportunity to tap into our innate capacity for awareness. So if it feels safe for you, I'd also invite you to close your eyes gently. And if you're feeling too tired right now, you might lower them just enough to let in the smallest sliver of light, just enough light to maintain your level of awareness, making sure to keep the muscles of your face relaxed as you're doing this. And as you settle into your posture more and more, I invite you to relax and let your attention shift. Let it shift away from everything going on outside and around you, and just settle into the space of your own body. Continue to tap into this immediate awareness. Noticing if, as you explore what's arising for you, if there's any tension or discomfort in your body that you might be able to settle or soften or release altogether. And feel free to make any adjustments to your posture. Just take your time to check in with yourself. Just exploring what's changing as you come to rest and stillness. Always remembering that you are the expert of your own body. So as we settle into our bodies, we can move forward and begin to settle our speech. And by this, I mean choosing to rest both externally and internally any dialogue about what's going on for us right now. So I would invite you to let go of anything about what you might have done differently in the past, or anything that you feel you need to attend to in the future. In this moment, just offer yourself the space to release these for now, and know that you can come back to them later. Now, to settle our minds more deeply, I'll invite you to take 21 deep breaths, if that's available to you. And if the breath can be an anchor for your practice, just go ahead and inhale deeply, slowly. And if it's of any support, you might consider counting each breath. Just try noting each one at the top of the exhale. Allow yourself to focus here on observing the unique quality and fullness of your breath. And if, as you breathe in, you notice tension arising in the body, perhaps around the mouth or the eyes, maybe in the back, or around the neck or shoulders, just feel free to release some of that tension. Just let your shoulders drop, relax your jaw, and just continue to breathe deeply. And if at any point along the path you lose count of these breaths or become distracted, simply note this with kindness and then return once again back to your breathing. And so, wherever you are with your counting, just allow your breath to be as it is without any extra attention or effort. Just let it return to whatever's normal for you. And if you like, take a moment to just linger in the qualities of your breath. Maybe find some delight there, or some comfort or ease. So now we shift our attention to the first phase of mindfulness of phenomena. And in this very first phase, we observed with a kind of kind curiosity the tactile sensations that we experience in our body. So you may notice maybe warmth where parts of your body are in contact. Maybe something more subtle or more internal. You might notice a sense of fullness if you're doing this practice after a meal. Maybe the subtle contractions of muscles deeper down. Or maybe something else that's subtle, like the feeling of your lips resting together. But focus your attention on these physical sensations. And allow yourself to observe each one as though you were an explorer, just looking and witnessing your own unique experience. And so let that consideration of tactile experience fade as you begin to attend to your unique perceptions of sound. So if you are a hearing person, you may begin to notice whatever you're hearing without judgment, without constructing a narrative, and without shaping your experience into categories. And if you are not a hearing person, but have access to observing vibrations, explore these instead. You may begin to notice those sounds or vibrations closest to you at first, noticing their texture, considering whether they're dull or bright, whether they're in front of you or behind you, or whether they're fleeting or insistent. Bring the fullness of your awareness to bear on your experiences of what you notice as sound or vibration arising in your awareness. And once again, let your awareness of these sounds and this sensorial experience fade away. And if it's available to you, bring your attention to your own unique experience of smell. This may be strong, maybe subtle. Right now, it may be neutral or maybe even imperceptible. You may be able to perceive the smell of a recently prepared meal, maybe even some care products that you have on your body. Whatever it is, just simply notice. Again, without preference or labeling, just noticing what's arising through these senses. And offer yourself the opportunity to really bring your full attention and awareness to this exploration. And so once again, let your awareness of sense fade away. And if it's available to you, bring your attention to your own unique experience of taste. Shifting your attention, you might consider the sensations perceived in the mouth or in the throat, Maybe there's a lingering flavor from tea or coffee. Maybe it's just the experience of warmth or lubrication as you swallow. This too, even if it's subtle, you can bring your attention to this and bear witness to your own unique experience. Not comparing it, not building a story around it, just observing. And so once more, allow the attention and awareness to just rest as these perceptions of taste fade away into the background. And in a moment, I'll invite you to slowly open your eyes. But before I do so, let's set the intention that when we open our eyes, we will be doing so as though we're witnessing what's around us for the very first time. So if you can, try to release the familiar tensions that you might have, or the familiar aspects and receptions that you might have with the space around you, or with its contents and occupants. Release even the image of yourself. Consider that you have the opportunity to notice shapes and light, textures, subtle movement, shadow, anything and everything, as though for the very first time. And so if you haven't done so, gently blink your eyes open, fully experience what you see around you. Bring your full attention and awareness to your own unique experience of seeing. And if you're not a seeing person, but you have access to perceptions of light, you can explore this instead. And then gently close the eyes again. Just resting in this awareness for a moment. So after perceiving in the ways that we just have, we might ask, what sits beyond touch and sound and smell and taste and sight? Or if we ask this in a different way, what supports our ability to perceive the qualities of these senses? And so we turn our attention to observe the space of the mind. And so you may notice in this moment thoughts arising. And we might attend to those thoughts as though we would an echo. We might allow them to arise strongly at first. And as we notice them without attachment, without judgment, each one might begin to fade away again and fade back into the space of the mind. And so simply observe and attend to this experience closely. Both the space of your mind and what's arising there. Just let it expand, let it unfold outwardly, and just grow. Attend to this, but don't feel the need to grasp onto anything. And know that it's okay if it seems difficult to really isolate where the mind is for you. Often I find I pull upwards and I'm exploring somewhere around my forehead. And I would question, what happens if we shift downwards towards our heart center? Or perhaps just let your explorations move beyond the space of the body entirely. And if it supports your practice, you might bring forth an intentional mental image, something simple, like imagining a tree in front of you. And just as quickly as this image arises, just release any hold that you have on it. And observe the space where the image arose, considering this to be the space of the mind. Just explore. And when it feels right, I invite you to slowly release all appearances, all aspirations, and all objects of the mind. And for a short time, gently rest your awareness in its own nature, in the awareness of being aware. Thank you for your practice.
Thank you. Wow. Wonderful to get that guidance and explore just our senses one by one. It really brought alive what you described for us of how can we really apply ourselves to understand all the pieces that create who we are and how we see this world. I think it's, very interesting to think about this phenomenological approach to working with our destructive emotions, really pulling apart what is it that is leading to that destructive emotion? What is it that we can feel as the destructive emotions? And then once we are aware of that, what options are available? Most of us only get some inkling that we're emotional when we're halfway through doing something we'll regret later. So this kind of really nuanced, subtle practice of feeling into those sense portals and seeing that those sense portals themselves, those are not the emotions. Maybe if, as you suggested, maybe if we felt full, then there might be some emotion that arises from, oof, gosh, I wish I hadn't eaten so much, or I'm still hungry. When is the next time I get to get up? But that these senses themselves, they're just senses. I think it's such an important investigation that we can do to start breaking apart that idea of our emotions happen to us, right? The world is showing up and doing these things to me, and I'm just this innocent victim. And when we see that actually our sensations are sensations, and as you mentioned, lots of stories come up, right? And the stories around our sensations So I think it really beautifully illustrated that. I want to shift a little and ask about embodiment in our practice. I know
Mm.
that's such an important area of personal investigation and something you also really support the communities you show up for. And I've heard you say before that our goal in practice isn't to let go of our identity. And um, I think it's a nuance that is sometimes lost in contemporary understanding of these practices. Can you say a bit more about our goal and what does it mean to have embodiment and identity and recognize the phenomenology? Another simple question.
Sure. It's an interesting consideration that's always with me, right? Because I am embodied in a very particular way, in a very particular place, in a very particular moment in time. And so I am both capable of and conflicted by having to hold these multiple realities at once, right? Really learning and understanding the conditioned nature of the way in which I identify as a me or myself or an I, and the suffering that comes along with that, of clinging so closely to, a construction of stories, a multiplicity of stories, a universe of stories. Um, and then I think about the beauty of that as well, that I am embodied specifically in this moment. I think of the Bodhisattva vows around this. Just I am embodied specifically in this moment and am uniquely equipped to do a kind of labor that I would not be able to do if I was differently embodied in this moment in this way. And so I hold a lot of reverence for the ultimate reality that we might be able to look at and question and learn and practice with, this notion of that conditioning being the root of suffering. And then I think of the communities of practice that I have, who are affected nonetheless, even if we hold on to this ultimate nature of reality, are affected nonetheless by the relative reality around them. And these are communities of, these are BIPOC communities, these are queer communities, these are communities of, disabled bodies, enabled bodies, these are communities of immigrants, these are trans communities, these are communities of people whose realities are shaped by the relative nature of what we have in front of us. And that can be quite off-putting when there is an expectation to relinquish that, to let it go, and to simply rest in this ultimate nature of things. So in the communities that I'm in, it is very much about practicing with what we have access to, practicing with the relative nature, practicing with the understanding that this embodiment is a tool through which we can actually see those kind of perceived elements of nature and of reality. And so I hold what you're saying with a lot of the irony, the large ironies of what it means to be both a practitioner and someone who is constantly saying, but why do I have to show up this way? And the difficulties of that and the beauty of that.
Yeah. Wow, that brings up so many more questions and reflections from that. One that really comes up for me is, given the context we live in now, this world, right? These embodiments. Why these ancient practices?
Hmm.
What is the value? What are we bringing forth, or is it the time to break form and start over? I'd be so curious your thoughts on yourself. You are a student of quite unique and very rich lineages, right? These are thousands of years old.
Yeah.
Why do they make sense today, if they do at all? Or like how, what's our adherence to the lineage, and then what's ours to make fresh now?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can answer all of that, but I think the why older practices, why wisdom traditions, why I mean, I think that in many ways these are called wisdom traditions because they do have a lineage, and they also have practices that oftentimes have proven track records of supporting these constructive emotional states, right? As a person who gravitated towards these practices and was very skeptical, remains skeptical, I met teachers who told me to hold to my skepticism, who reminded me that my skepticism was sacred, and who really equipped me with the resources to say, we have understandings that these have worked before. We have understandings that they serve as complementary practices to so much of what modern science, modern psychology, modern psychiatry have to offer. And so if we can find ways to fit them into contemporary life, why wouldn't we? It doesn't mean that we have to, and I think this is true. I think I know one of my teachers, Venerable Rabina Kortan, and Lama Tupten Yeshe, have talked about these kind of bubbles of realities, bubbles of relativities. And when I think of those bubbles, these are permeable, right? They're dynamic. And some of what you and I have talked about, Eve, before is just the ways in which we get so ossified in our ability to see both ourselves and what comes into our spheres of influences. Like, when do you burst the bubble is something that I'm hearing you say as well. And it's like, why do you have to burst the bubble? Why can't you just let the bubble expand? Why can't the bubble transform? Does it even need to be a bubble? These are very large philosophical questions, and I know that I'm offering more questions than answering them, but I think that at the root of what I'm hearing, it is, do we need one or the other? Are there ways of blending? And I always go in the amalgamation, that we are stronger as an amalgamation of understandings and ideas, and holding true to this doesn't have to be the only thing. That we can gain more by learning, we can gain more by growing, but we don't have to hold on to it so tightly that it restricts us from letting go, and it restricts us from growing and expanding differently.
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind is I wish I could remember who, some very wise practitioner said, I know you love New York, Christian, as I do myself, and you can make your way across town. You can go from downtown all the way to Harlem and figure it out. But if you have a map, you're probably going to get there a bit quicker, right? Especially if it's a subway map. So these practices, it's almost, they give us a map. Like you said, it's well-tread territory. And I think it's such an interesting balance between just taking what is offered to us and then trying it on ourselves, as you said, like holding that healthy skepticism. And I think what, coming back to this idea of destructive emotions, so much of what gets in the way of, I'd say, the world we'd all like to be living in, this world where there's much more abundance of these constructive emotional states, is a real sense of overwhelm by our own destructive tendencies, our own either enactments of destructive emotions, or even the feelings we have that make us feel separate or different from one another. So it's interesting to think of what is this role of kind of pulling apart our identity so that we don't take our self so seriously, and that our destructive emotions don't just implicate who we are, right? These are just experiences we have, they come and go. And honoring our identity, just as you said, it is our vehicle here, our way that we're getting around, our way that we're interacting and engaging. And just want to highlight how important, and I would dare say, still not totally well understood that balance is, right? We want to pull apart what you described as our conditioning, right? And we want to really honor this experience of being embodied in this world, in this time. So I'd love to hear a bit more from you about how this shows up for you in, in the everyday. Like, how does that work? How is that coming into your practice and interactions and relationships?
If I can push the New York metaphor a bit more, because there is something there. I think it is true. You go faster with a map, and I think maybe you go even faster when you have community. And I think in New York, the fastest way to get anywhere, and maybe the most frustrating way sometimes, is to just ask someone, where do I go? I'm trying to go here. I don't know where I am. And if someone can even point out the smallest things, like the numbers go up as you go north, the numbers go down as you go east, it's almost enough to orient yourself. And so where these practices show up for me is really in community. I teach as a visiting teacher at the East Bay Meditation Center. I teach in other places in the United States. I also teach in other places in Russia. the Foundation for Contemplative Practice, and I am always blown away by what is happening in community, right? I am working in communities that are almost most at threat, especially right now, by the relative conditions of what's going on in the world, what's going on in this country. And so the practices that are showing up are practices that are rooted in compassion. They're rooted in the things that people need right now. They're practical as much as they are in service of larger transformations. They're practical. It's helping people to work with the destructive emotions that are coming up on a moment by moment, day-to-day basis. There is such practicality for me around this, that it is not simply, you know, an esoteric collection of practices or words or phrasing or ways of sitting and feeling, you know, very stoic. It is the way of being in the world. It's the way that we're in right relationship with one another. I think of the East Bay Meditation Center as this kind of vanguard of doing the deeper cultural work of integrating practice into change making, cultural change making, political change making, corporate change making. I think of the ways in which the practices have been distilled down into practical applications of, here are agreements that we have about how we can speak to one another. Here are accepted practices for how we want to listen, how we want to honor, how we want to feel with one another, and how we can be safe together. And so I see these practices as ways of conditioning that kind of safety internally so that it can actually be expressed externally. But I see that as individual. So it is absolutely about individual transformation. It is absolutely about realizing these deeper forms of emptiness and of undoing these conditioned realities of like a little ball of stories I tell myself about who and what I am. But it is absolutely interdependent. It is deeply connected to the ways in which I am in relation to the ways in which other people are, and learning to navigate that is always shifting, that I have to constantly be vigilant and attentive to how I am translating these practices, how I am translating the world, right, relative and ultimate, into how other people are practicing them, that I'm always working in that space of connection. And that just makes these so much richer for me. Mm. So the New York metaphor feels apt.
I really, really love how you wove in there that balance between the work we need to do, the inner world, the kind of forging those pathways alongside the work we're doing together. Mm. I think it's such an important piece of these practices. And, you know, our emotions, at least 99% of the time, involve someone else. Either them right in front of us or us thinking about them. And so when we're thinking about why to address emotions as part of our meditation practice, it really helps us understand that these relationships are so crucial, right? For each and every part of our practice. Even if we had the possibility of escaping to New Zealand and getting away from everything, and we have our perfect little environment with all the food we like and all the music we like, and we still have our own mind, filled with the stories, filled with the memories, filled with the ideas of others. And so there's truly no escape from working with our challenging emotions and working with our most important relationships. So, yeah, I appreciate you highlighting that together. And are there any last words you'd like to share for our audience here of anything around constructive or destructive emotions?
I think what you're laying out is, it's the reminder. When I think of the work that I do, I oftentimes don't think of it as care work. And I know you and I have spoken about this as well. It's a lot to show up for other people's emotions, let alone our own. It's a lot. And having the tools and the practices to be able to do that is really important. I think of the suffering that goes on, the suffering that I experience of not knowing how to show up for it. What do I do when this bad feeling arises? What do I do when this emotion kind of creeps in and starts to take over and take root? And then I think of these practices of loving kindness and these practices of compassion, of looking at other people who are suffering, who are experiencing and expressing negative emotions, or things that we don't call negative emotions, but these destructive emotions, right? And the ways in which they are limited from transforming those into constructive emotions. I think of the ways in which it just stunts so much growth, so much community building, so much problem solving, so much creativity. And the ways in which practices like this, practices that allow us to actually cultivate a sense of what it feels like inside for ourselves, allows us to get a little bit closer and build a little bit more empathy and compassion for other people. So I love what you're pointing out of, we can't get away from other people's emotions. So we might as well find practical tools to figure out how to be in relationship with those emotions and in relationship with our own.
Thank you so much, Christian. Such a delight to have this time together.
Thank you.
And yeah, thank you all of our participants. We hope you enjoyed the session as much as we have enjoyed being with you, and enjoy the rest of your time.